Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining this session on impact investing and the Sustainable Development Goals. My name is Giselle Leung. I'm a managing director from the Global Impact Investing Network, or GIIN for short. It's a pleasure to have all of you join us today virtually. I'm also joined today by Jessica Houssian, co-CEO of Equality Fund, as well as Rehana Nathoo, Senior Advisor of Equality Fund. Now, we're going to start this session with a short poll with a few questions. I'd like to direct you to all, please look at your chat box where you will find the poll icon for a few brief questions that will help us understand who is joining us in this conversation today. We will be referring to the results later on during the course of the session. My role for this session is to kick us off by providing an overview of how the Sustainable Development Goals factor into impact investing and how the SDGs are used in the investment process. I'll also briefly share some of the resources that the GIIN, the organization I work for, offers for anyone who is interested in investing in the SDGs. Then I'll turn it over to Jessica and Rehana, who will share some practical example of putting SDG investment into practice with a focus on SDG 5, gender equality, how to use gender lens investing to shift power and unlock new capital for women's rights organizations. First, just a few remarks about the Global Impact Investing Network. Next slide, please. We're going to start the slide deck, but the GIIN is a global champion of impact investing dedicated to increasing the scale and effectiveness of impact investing around the world. Impact investments, as you may know, are investments made with the intention to generate measurable positive social and environmental impact alongside financial return. Everything that we do at the GIIN is in service of helping impact investors have a greater impact on the world's most urgent, most pressing challenges. We're a network of tens of thousands of individuals, as well as over 350 member organizations from over 40 plus countries, representing foundations, family offices, pensions, insurers, diverse fund managers, etc. Our organization was founded 11 years ago when the idea of impact investing was still largely unknown. And since then, in the years since, we've been focusing on reducing barriers to impact investing by building critical industry infrastructure, convening investors, and also conducting a variety of research. All of this work that we do, next slide, please, is in service of realizing a vision where finance really works for all members of society and planet, and importantly, that impact is integrated into all investment decisions. Next, please. Now, enough about the GIIN. Let's turn to the SDGs. Chances are many of you joining this call, perhaps as in your philanthropic work, you're already advancing issues that are tied to this ambitious global agenda that was adopted by the United Nations in 2015. Be it reducing poverty, working on providing access to basic services, combating climate change, etc. Now, it is estimated that $2.5 trillion annually are needed in order to meet these goals by 2030. And that's just 9 years away. And it's obvious that this is a large financing gap that philanthropy and government aid alone cannot be met. And this is where impact investing comes in. These goals map closely to the interests of impact investors who are trying to leverage the power of capital to achieve social and environmental impact. And we're also seeing many traditionally organizations that focus on philanthropy, grant making, adding impact investing to the toolkit as another means to achieve the mission and the programmatic objectives. And this interest is met not only from the philanthropic side, but also mainstream finance, such as pensions, insurers, etc. Next slide, please. Now, the relevance of SDGs has only increased in the wake of the global pandemic, which has exacerbated many of the challenges that the SDGs are trying to achieve. It is a global health crisis, And we also see major disruptions in education, food security, livelihoods. The disproportionate impacts on women, girls, and marginalized community further shine a spotlight on entrenched inequality based on race, gender, ethnicity, etc. That's been experienced around the world. Next, please. Now, add to all of this, we also are seeing growing alarm of climate crisis. In the midst of all of this, there are calls from across society, from non-government NGOs, the government, philanthropic sector, businesses, and investors, all calling from a recovery as we emerge from this global pandemic that is inclusive, equitable, and sustainable. And achieving the SDGs will be an important means to realizing that reality. Next. So how do the SDGs factor into impact investing? To start, next please. To start, the SDGs provide an entry point for investors who are new to considering social and environmental impact in their investment decisions. For some coming from a foundation space, moving from grant making and extending to impact investing, it also provides a holistic frame to discuss the type of goals that they like to accomplish through programs as well as investments. The SDGs is also provide a communication tool for fund managers that are offering impact products. The SDGs are also being used as a framework for developing impact strategies and goals. So for example, you're interested in SDG 8, decent work and economic growth, and you may then think about the strategy is to improve rural economies through providing access to finance. Now, it's important to note SDGs is not purely a marketing and communication tool. To really make sure that it has teeth, it is important that the SDGs are integrated throughout the investment process, and that's what impact investors are doing in a number of ways. For example, during sourcing, next slide. This slide, please stay on. For example, during sourcing and due diligence, investors may undertake a screening process to determine the potential of an investment to advance one or more SDGs. When they're selecting an investment, they may also be thinking about what's the impact target that I'd like this particular investment to accomplish, and how do I integrate this in my conversation with the portfolio companies. During the investment management process, impact investors set aside, put together impact measurement and management plans, or IMM, to measure, report on, and manage impact towards progress for the SDGs. Now at exit, again, progress towards SDGs should be featured front and center, and it's also an opportunity for existing investors to think about how can the progress made live on beyond the life of the investment. I'd like to particularly underscore the importance of measuring and managing progress towards the SDGs. There's some who rightly are concerned about impact washing, that the SDGs are simply being used as icons used in marketing materials and annual reports. So with that, what is really crucial in our view at the GIIN is that investments into SDGs must be backed by data about impact performance. I'll return to this point in just a little bit. Next. A few years ago, the GIIN published a report called Financing the Sustainable Development Goals, Impact Investing in Action, that showcases 5 examples of impact investors that are allocating capital to various SDGs that they're working towards. These case studies showcase how the SDGs are woven throughout the investment process, how the impact investors do so, what their motivations, and also highlight some advice they have for the market. You can access this report to learn more, and I believe a link to this research will be inserted into the chat box momentarily. Next. Now I'd like to switch gear, zoom out, and share some market snapshots of SDG investing before ending with some resources that can support your journey in impact investing into the SDGs. The findings that I'm sharing are based on the 2020 edition of the GIIN's annual Impact Investor Survey, where we received responses from nearly 300 impact investors around the world. What we see here is SDGs are, there's a variety types of impact areas tied to the SDGs that investors are targeting. The majority target SDG 8, decent work and economic growth, as well as SDG 1, no poverty. We also see significant focus in areas of health, gender inequality, affordable and clean energy, etc. It is also important to highlight that impact investors tend to focus in multiple SDGs with an average of 8, in fact, 8 SDGs per investor based on the survey. Next. This slide that you see here affirms that SDGs are a commonly used framework for impact measurement and management. Next. Specifically, SDGs are used for setting impact objectives. So for example, the objective may be I want to work towards quality education, I want to work towards climate action or affordable and clean energy. As I mentioned before, it is important to walk the talk, and investors that are focusing on the SDGs should be measuring the progress towards the specific goals that they're addressing. Now, in the middle of this chart, you will also see that it points to IRIS as a commonly used tool for measuring and reporting performance. This will be the middle 2 columns in teal, that's IRIS. And I'm going to share a little bit in the next couple of minutes this particular tool that the GIIN has developed that supports impact investors in measuring progress towards the SDGs. Next, please. Now, impact measurement and management has been a core focus of the GIIN since we were founded. In 2019, we launched IRIS Plus, which is the generally accepted system to measure, manage, and optimize impact. It is designed to help investors translate their intention into real results and to provide comparable metrics so that investors can truly make sense of the impact investments that of the impact performance that their investments are making. Next, please. So how do investors use IRIS Plus when it comes to the SDGs? The IRIS Plus system is aligned to the SDGs, which means, for example, you can start with selecting the SDGs that you're focusing on, say SDG 5, gender equality. And then from there, you can select your strategic goals towards this particular SDG. It may be increasing gender equality through financial inclusion or reducing gender inequalities in pay. And then from there, you can access evidence-backed metrics that allows you to measure progress towards the specific strategies that you're pursuing. And you will be able to also access comprehensive research-based overviews, understanding the particular strategic goal that you're working towards. Who does the goal target? How does a particular intervention works, etc. And it is also important to note that the IRIS Plus metrics that you'll find are also all aligned to SDGs at the target level. Next, please. So IRIS Plus is a key tool that the GIIN offers for those interested in either deepening their work in investing in the SDGs or just getting started. Next slide. There are a couple of other resources that I invite you to look at after this call if you're interested. As I mentioned before, the GIIN is a global membership, a global network, and our membership offers opportunities for convening and meeting with peers, learning about impact investing practices and strategies, etc. We also convene investors through various events that are open to the public, including the GIIN Investor Forum, that is our flagship in-person event that we'll host again next October in 2022 at The Hague. Lastly, we also have a deep pool of research looking at market trends, particular practice areas, and topics. So I'd like to invite you, if you're interested, to learn more about the resources that we have at the GIIN. And without further ado, now that I provided just an overview of how SDGs fit within impact investing, let's turn to Jessica, who's going to walk us through impact investing in SDGs in practice through the Equality Fund. So I'll turn it over to you, Jessica.
Thank you so much, Giselle. I really appreciate that. Hi, everybody. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, perhaps, depending on where you are. I'm Jess Houssian, co-CEO of the Equality Fund. I wish to acknowledge that I live and work on the unceded and traditional territories of the Coast Salish people, specifically the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. We started the Equality Fund 2 years ago to build and design a new model to deliver sustainable resources, specifically money and power, to women's rights organizations and feminist movements globally. Our model brings together bold government funding, courageous feminist philanthropy, a dynamic global grant-making program, and gender lens impact investing strategy to shift power and resources sustainably and at scale. I can't think of a better person to take you through this in more detail than my friend and co-conspirator, Rehana Nathoo, who is the founder and CEO of Spectrum Impact and also a senior advisor to the Equality Fund. So Rehana, without further ado, over to you.
Thank you so much, Jess. It's such a pleasure to be with all of you. And Giselle, thank you kindly for such important historical context setting around impact investing and the evolution of this space. Just want to second that the GIIN has just been a deeply catalytic field building organization within the impact investing ecosystem. So if you have time and energy to check out their resources, I highly recommend it as somebody who uses them often. So thank you, Giselle. So I'm thrilled to talk in detail about the Equality Fund as an example of actually putting impact investment principles to work, specifically around achieving our bold targets around SDG 5. So if we can switch to the slides, please, that would be wonderful. So a little bit of context setting around the Equality Fund. We'll give you a little bit of an overview of what the Equality Fund is, and then we will switch over to gender lens investing specifically for folks that are a little bit new to this work. So we can go ahead to the next slide, please. And one more, if you wouldn't mind. So a little bit about why we exist. I think those of you that are focusing on gender in any of its manifestations will know a lot of the details that we're here to share with you today. But most importantly, I think we wanted to provide 3 different dimensions of the urgency of gender: gender and violence, gender and climate, and gender and technology. So feel free to peruse these stats at your leisure, but I wanted to call out a couple that are actually incredibly meaningful as we think about actually achieving our goals globally around eradication of poverty and improving quality of life. So the first is that gender and violence is costly. We know that the violence against women actually costs us about 2% of global GDP, and that women that are exposed to intimate partner violence are employed in higher and higher numbers in casual and part-time work. So that means that things like quality of life, building good jobs, increasing representation of women in formal employment, all actually matter to all of us. That there's a lot of gains as a global society that we could have, both financially and other, if we were to actually protect women. We also know that women are disproportionately exposed to the negative impacts of climate. 70% of the world's poor are women, and that the ability to adapt to climate-related risks particularly hits women and girls more than any other subgroup across the planet. 80% of the people that are displaced by climate change, specifically natural events like large-scale floods, droughts, and storms, are people that identify as women and girls. So we have a lot of work to do at the intersection of climate and women, which we'll talk about today, to make sure that we're not just protecting our planet, but we're protecting the people that are affected the most by this changing planet. And then, especially as we're all having a completely virtual conference, the role and importance of technology is not lost on us. Our societies are increasingly digital. Active participation is required, and digital access makes that possible. The gender digital divide, which is defined by access to internet, is 32.9% in the world's least developed countries. So quite frankly, just to put that into context, if 600 million more women were connected to the internet in the next 3 years, we could see a global rise of GDP between 13 and $18 billion, which is no small feat. So we're here today to talk not just about the urgency of gender, but the opportunity, which is something that the Equality Fund really represents. Next slide, please. So we want to tell you a little bit about what we're doing to solve this really incredible gap around women and girls. And that is simply to build a feminist financial ecosystem. So our goal is to do that by shifting lasting power and resources to the feminist movements that actually sit closest to the people that we want to serve and support. And to do that, we have to be willing to disrupt the status quo. I think there are lots of different systems that we all operate in that make it very clear that we have lots of change and disruption to be responsible for, but nowhere is that more true than in the financial ecosystem, which for us represents this very intricate network of investment activity, including capital, consumers, supply, demand, products and services, that this web really requires the kind of disruption that is going to ensure that the capital markets work for all of us. So we have created an investment strategy that actually has an eye towards this long-term vision to change the way that the financial ecosystem actually serves all of its constituents, with a specific eye towards women, girls, and non-binary people. And so I want to spend a few moments today to tell you a little bit about how we're doing that through our model. Next slide, please. So at the, you can continue, thank you so much. So at the Equality Fund, we basically have three major goals for our investment program: activate, disrupt, and sustain. So under activation, that target is very, very detailed and very clear. Our goal is to mobilize $1 billion of resources across various funding and investment sources that will be intended for feminist organizations over the next 15 years. We hope to do that by disrupting. So we want to shift the power and resources directly to women-led and women-focused funds, products, businesses, and services that are changing fundamentally the inequality around the capital markets and the financial systems that we operate in. And we want to do that in a sustainable way. I'm going to talk to you in a few moments about our very unique model. But one of the things that is a little bit different in our organization versus other types of organizations is that our investment program is meant to generate returns that will continue to support grant making, particularly towards global gender equality focused initiatives, sustainably, in perpetuity, and free from, I think, the fundraising, let's call it roller coaster, that I think a lot of you experience on a daily basis. Next slide, please. So quite frankly, the way that we do that is a very integrated model. You can continue to the next slide if you wouldn't mind. So there are three pieces of our model that are really important here. We've thrown a lot of content at you, so don't feel any obligation to read this. I'll talk a little bit about how it works. So the core reason that we exist, the reason that the Equality Fund was created, designed, and executed today is our grant making strategy. So our mandate here is very clear. We want to move resources boldly and sustainably to women's organizations and feminist movements. And there's two ways that we make that grant making happen: investments and philanthropy. So I'll start on the investment side. This is really, we think about this as the engine that makes grant making possible. Our investment dollars are deployed into income generating, risk adjusted opportunities to help sustain those grant making needs. For a lot of you that are in the investment world or know how hard it is to generate and run an endowment to be able to support grant making, you will know that that has some serious implications for the kinds of assets that we're in. But unlike typical foundations that do impact driven grant making on one side, then run an endowment and don't necessarily run the investment philosophy aligned with their values, we're taking a different approach. So in the endowment that is fueling and funding our grant making, we have designed a 100% gender lens portfolio, which basically means that every single dollar that we deploy must be screened for their impact on women and girls. And we're going to talk about how we do that through the tool of gender lens investing. So being able to run the investment program sustainably, in a risk-adjusted way, in a liquid way, but for women and girls, is a big part of the challenge that we've undertaken over the last 18 months. And then on the other side of the Equality Fund is our philanthropy program. So one of the other systems that deeply needs disruption is the system of philanthropy, something that so many of you know well, creating a shared purpose where we can actually promote a more equitable world for everybody. So the philanthropy program, in addition to running this incredible organization, one of the things that Jess specifically spends most of her time and energy on, and we'll touch on that a little bit later, raises funds directly from philanthropists that will directly support grant making. But the way that the philanthropy program works is actually quite unique. In addition to the fundraising mandate, The philanthropy program also brings together change makers, disruptors, and catalysts, and creates networks to learn and give. Being able to work for women and girls is actually a relatively new piece of work that I think collectively as a global society we're really focusing on, especially over the last 5 years. And so the philanthropy program at the Equality Fund wants to be able to learn, train, network, and connect. It has to be so much more than just fundraising. We need to be able to provide philanthropists with the resources to actually make some of this change. Next slide, please. So these three pieces work together, and specifically, they are fueled by a $300 million contribution by the Government of Canada in 2019, which is the largest single investment ever made by a government in global feminist movements. So in partnership with the Toronto Foundation and Rock Creek, we have activated the $300 million seed to create the 100% gender lens endowment. And that will, in essence, catalyze our vision of truly building the largest self-sustaining fund for gender equality in the world. Next slide, please. We are early. Jess so articulately says that we are in a phase of design and build, and it feels like with all that is at stake, we are constantly working with partners on the ground, activists, feminist organizations, women's rights organizations, to try and find a way to do this more and more thoughtfully, ensuring that we are using tools available in the investment ecosystem to achieve these goals. And one of the ways that we've been able to do that is through gender lens investing. So I just wanted to take a few moments to present GLI to those of you that don't know it, and to remind all of you that whether you are working through the Equality Fund model or not, gender lens investing is actually available to all of us. If you could go to the next slide, please. So just for a little bit of historical context setting, gender lens investing, specifically following Giselle's lead around providing clear definitions, is really a tool that is available to address gender issues or promote gender equity in the investment domain. Today, the total value of private capital that is invested with a gender lens is estimated to be just under $5 billion globally. That number is changing in real time. And the growth of gender lens strategies on the public markets on the other side of the spectrum is about $3.5 billion at the end of 2019. And so I think we've seen in the dollars that are allocated towards impact, gender lens investing and gender lens products specifically really on the rise. As a reminder, we're really talking about the ability to apply a lens that focuses on women and girls in the investment process. And that lives not just in due diligence, who you look for and who gets capital, but also in the investment operations and process side of things. What are the networks by which you look for investment opportunities? Are we actually providing a spotlight and an opportunity to first-time female-run funds or products or companies? Are we investing in companies that have an explicit target to support and help women and girls? There's lots of different elements of gender lens investing that allow us to maximize those tools. Next slide, please. So I want to talk a little bit about how that actually works in practice. There are some incredible organizations, some of them represented in today's conversation, that have been hard at work over the last 5 to 8 years to build gender lens frameworks that are robust. And typically speaking, there are 3 different dimensions, 3 different outcomes that gender lens investment tools try to screen for. At the Equality Fund, we're using this as a basic framework to actually create our own custom GLI criteria for our very complex and exciting portfolio. But this is really the framework that we start with. So across those outcomes, we have increasing access to capital, scaling products and services that support women, and then actually addressing structural equity. So in increasing access to capital, we're talking specifically about investments made into funds and companies that provide that capital to previously overlooked populations. Sometimes that's true for gender, but we've also seen that manifest itself across the globe, across race, socioeconomic status, and sexual orientation. So this is one way that GLI makes this happen, but you could see a manifestation of this across underrepresented communities as it results to the financial markets. So increasing access to capital specifically often shows up in the private markets. So those of you who are familiar with this often see this in venture capital, private equity, and private debt. Then we have scaling products and services that particularly support women. So these are investments in companies that produce goods and services that benefit women. To Giselle's really helpful orientation at the start of our conversation today, I think you all have a sense of how interconnected the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, are. And so one of the ways that we see this happen is at some of this intersection. So for example, in health and wellness. We see a lot of really incredible investments made into building health and wellness for women and girls who have disproportionately been ignored from the health tech economy. Often we see this type of screen applied most effectively in the private market, specifically private debt, but that's changing in very real time. And then fundamentally, we have this third outcome of addressing structural inequality. And this is really about investments in public companies that elevate women into decision-making and investment roles with true agency to affect meaningful enterprise change. And so for those of you that are mostly in the public markets, you have probably seen lots of really great work from some of our partners like Equileap to really measure and manage the role that women play in making key decisions in publicly listed companies. And that could be everything from the C-suite to the board to pay equity, sexual harassment policies. We see lots of really, really great work being done to change and address structural inequality in some of the largest organizations in the world. Next slide, please. So I want to take just a moment to talk a little bit about what that looks like in action. Next slide, please. And specifically want to use this opportunity to invite Jess to talk a little bit about the creativity that has been employed to really make sure that we have all the voices at the table. So Jess, if I could turn it over to you, please.
Sure, thanks, Rehana. I think just to speak to this slide a little bit, the Equality Fund is a dynamic, it's a new model with no roadmap. And in our DNA is the establishment and the nurturing of dynamic partnerships across multi-sectors and actors who understand the power in and the value of investing deeply in feminist organizing and global gender equality. When we came together in 2018, 2019 to create the Equality Fund, we did so because we were a group of folks from across these organizations that you see on the slide, now really frustrated and dissatisfied with the status quo, both with how unsatisfactorily money was flowing to feminist movements from the international development sector, including from bilateral donors, and also frustrated at the pace of change, and really collecting evidence that we know how change can be so catalytic when it is led by those who are proximate to communities, proximate to problems, and have their own local solutions to global problems. So we came together as leaders from across these different organizations to design a new model fit for purpose to respond to the Government of Canada's very bold call for proposals for a new way that would deliver sustainable movements to sustainable resources to global movements. And the Equality Fund is our answer to that call.
Thank you so much, Jess. I really appreciate that. If we could switch to the next slide. One of the things I think that's quite innovative about the way that we've tried to live that spirit that Jess just described into the investment process is building an investment advisory council. So those of you that are familiar on the investment side of managing this capital know fully that investment committees are important and powerful functions in the discretion around where dollars go. But particularly because we are sitting at the nexus of this really, really important, historically complicated issue of building true equitable partnership for women and girls, we created something called the Investment Advisory Council, which is a diverse body of investors, feminist activists, economists, women's rights advocates, that come together to ensure that the strategic decisions that we make on the investment side is really, really reflective of their hard-earned wisdom and experience working on these complex issues on the ground. So the council provides advice to our investment team and the Equality Fund's investment committee. And we create a truly collaborative approach where investment decisions are always taking into account what we know about the way women and girls are treated in the places that we work. So that has actually been quite important to the work that we do. I want to take just a pause in a moment because there's been some great questions that have come in, particularly around the GLI side. And also want to invite Jess and Giselle, as there have been other sort of broader questions and comments before we pivot back. Allison Pyatt and the wonderful folks at Veris helpfully provided some more context that I just want to make sure that I don't miss, and that is that the GLI public products mandate, the assets under management that I cited a little bit earlier, are $12 billion and climbing. So for those of you, and on the private side, between $15 to $20 billion. So those of you who are hearing from some of your co-asset owners, investment committee, wealth managers, that GLI is a small thing, please do feel very comfortable accessing various research, gender smart research, to happily wave some of that data in their face that we are increasingly not niche, and this is increasingly a broad investment universe. I also wanted to speak to a quick question about how COVID has really exacerbated the impact on women and girls around the globe. One of the things that the Equality Fund has tried to do really thoughtfully is structure multi-stakeholder conversations that live actually outside of just the Investment Advisory Council. And the way that we have done that is through roundtables that bring in some of these really diverse perspectives to give us a real-time read on how women and girls have been affected by the pandemic. And in our investment strategy, one of the things that has remained, that has really popped up for us, is that there are all kinds of solutions that investments can provide, and then many solutions that investments cannot. So Jess, maybe if okay with you, I would love to tag you for just a moment to talk about how the philanthropy program and other parts of the Equality Fund are actually addressing the non-investment side of things. I know that's why we're here today, but I think one of the coolest things about this model is pulling on the other levers like bilateral conversations, government engagement, and philanthropy to really meet folks where the need is. So if you wouldn't mind talking about that for just a few moments.
Sure. I mean, I'll just say briefly, I think one of the most interesting things that has happened in the life cycle over 2 years of the Equality Fund is that just as we were awarded $300 million from the Canadian government, just as we were starting to design our grant-making program and our investment program and building our big, beautiful team of global feminists to come and work at the Equality Fund and designing and building our global board of directors, many of you would have just met our amazing co-chair, Theo Soa, in the session before this, I know, is that we were met with a global pandemic. And to be honest, we had a moment of, oh my goodness, is this time to put this down for a month or two and ride this out and pick up the work when we're on the other side of it? And the answer was, of course, no, that in fact, we were born for this moment. The Equality was born for this moment, because what do we know about how disasters, pandemics, any sort of climate crisis, that it affects women and girls disproportionately. And what became very clear from our global grantee partners around the world is that they were reaching out to us as a trusted partner to say, we need help more than ever. So we quickly pivoted to a philanthropic campaign. We were able to raise a couple $100,000 from our partners very quickly, and move that money swiftly and without condition, as we do, to our grantee partners to really support their work and how they were being disproportionately affected by the effects of the pandemic. I think we're also seeing this both through our philanthropic work and opportunities through our investment program. As we look at the care economy, Canada has also, in the last federal budget, made a huge commitment to care, both in Canada and globally. So there are a number of ways that we're starting to see that issues that are disproportionately affecting girls, women, and non-binary folks around the world have been really exacerbated and highlighted. Rehana talked a little bit about intimate partner violence and gender-based violence, which we refer to as the shadow pandemic. It's incredible how much we are hearing that issues of gender-based violence have accelerated and exacerbated as a result of COVID-19. And could you imagine for a moment being home for a year and a half when home is the most dangerous place for you? So a number of ways that we are activating through our policy advocacy program at the Equality Fund, by activating our philanthropic donor partners to be able to respond swiftly through the Equality Fund, and by activating our investment program so that, again, this multi-sector model is activating under one tent, one ecosystem in order to respond.
And I'd like to chime in here to this question that Rehana, you teed that up for, in terms of the disproportionate impact of pandemic on women and girls. And that's a question that's really front and center for the impact investing community. And I think this is, gender lens investing is, as it is called, is a lens, and it should be a consideration. Equity, be it gender, be it race, etc., should really be considered across all types of investments. And the way that the GIIN believes what we need to really move to in order to amplify the impact on equity, on equality, is how to go, in an investment perspective, go beyond what I like to call kind of a single impact theme siloed approach. Folks may be thinking about, I am an agriculture focused investor, or I'm interested in climate change mitigation. But there's really a real opportunity to think about more holistically. If I'm investing in, real estate for affordable housing, am I providing jobs for historically underserved communities? When I'm investing in solutions to address climate change, am I targeting those geographies and demographics, such as women and girls, that are disproportionately affected by the climate crisis? So this kind of quote unquote cross-tagging, applying this equality, applying this equity lens to various investment themes is where impact investing, certainly is a direction that we'd like to see it to go. And the IRIS Plus system that I spoke to earlier, that really is a framework, a standard in thinking about how to consider strategic goals and metrics, is also set up in such a way that for every impact theme, every IRIS Plus theme that we work on, you can look purely at gender lens, as well as if you go click on agriculture or education. We also really make a concerted effort to ensure that demographics, when it comes to women and girls and other marginalized communities, are factored into the investment strategies and the metrics that one can be measured. So I wanted to add that in a broader impact investing context. There's another question that comes up, in both, Rehana's and Jessica's remarks on the Equality Fund, talks about philanthropy and, of course, the investment side. And there's a question about how to pursue, SDG, address any number of SDGs. And make sure that there's not a siloed approach between philanthropy and the investment arm. The example that I would offer, for example, is in a foundation. You have program colleagues that are working on programmatic objectives. What we have seen is hugely important for both sides, for the program staff and the investment team, to really have dialogues about what is it that we are trying to accomplish as an organization. What are those focus areas that we as a foundation, or we as a family office, or we as an organization trying to focus, and then really align on what impact are we driving. And then you work backwards and you think about what are those opportunities where grants really are the best tool to make. What are those opportunities that an investment is really the best tool? That way you kind of have greater spaciousness in looking at the tools that you have, from traditional grant making to maybe concessionary risk, catalytic capital, providing guarantees, and all the way, if you're managing a corpus, as Rehana mentioned in one of the slides, you're also building out investment strategies that can fetch risk-adjusted market rate returns, but you're all aligned in terms of ultimately at the top what you're trying to accomplish and what tools. Maybe one other question I will take before turning over to see if there are other questions for Jessica and Rehana to respond to. There's a question also about thinking the time frame of measuring social return. And the answer is, it depends. There's no one, is not, if you're making an investment in, education, in GLI, gender lens investing, et cetera, it really depends on what type of investment, right? The term of the investment, if it is supporting, what we call a patient capital that you're providing, that may take an investment term that may take 7, 8, 9 years. That may become the time frame that you use in thinking about what am I projecting to be the end impact when I exit. So it really kind of varies depending on the particular investment opportunity that an investor is pursuing. Perhaps Rehana and Jessica can build on that, or speak to other questions that have come up, but I'll turn it over to you.
No, Giselle, I love that. That's a really important flag. I think that's come up a lot in our work about, okay, so you build a strategy and you build an intentional strategy, and then how do you know that it's working? I wanted to actually just touch on something that you had said about intersectionality, and a question around intersectionality had come up I think in the chat. So one of the things that I mentioned that the Equality Fund is building over the next 8 months is our gender lens investment criteria. And it was very important for us to work with industry standards and frameworks, informed pretty heavily actually by resources like the GIIN's gender lens investment portal and the IRIS indicators. And that has certainly been where we've started. One of the things that we have sort of challenged ourselves to do a little bit more on is integrating these lenses in a truly intersectional approach. So thinking about race and justice, thinking about climate, thinking about financial and economic inclusion, all integrated with gender. We hear a lot of time with clients, and at the Equality Fund, we've felt this ourselves. It is a hard task to pull all these things together in a way that still espouses investment rigor. Any investor will tell you that the more that you narrow, the more panicked that they get. And so is there a way to build these lenses thoughtfully and realistically, because we know that none of these issues exist in a silo, but also be able to use a truly robust investment universe? And though it's early days for us, I think we have been so relieved, quite frankly, to see that the answer is yes, that in fact, the more lenses that we integrate together, the more robust our pipeline gets, not the opposite. And that has been very, very true for our investment strategy over time. So to those of you who are facing a similar sort of concern and struggle to make sure that all these things live together, I guess I would say that our experience so far has been that the more that we integrate these lenses, the better quality investments we seem to be finding, and not the opposite. And that's maybe just important to sort of to say out loud. So I just wanted to add that, Giselle, to your very thoughtful point around building all these things together and not in a silo.
And I would just add, I think that that's a very good news story, Rehana, and thank you for sharing it. And it's because the issues out in the world are not siloed, right? And so our interventions and what we resource need to be intersectional as well. A lot of the women's rights defenders and organizations that we at the Equality Fund are funding through our grant making program are actually climate justice, climate defenders first, right? And because we know that these issues are so intersectional in and of themselves. Maybe a question, or just to address the question around disruptive philanthropy and what it means to us. I think, first of all, engaging in impact investing is disruption in and of itself of status quo or traditional philanthropy, right? I think we as funders are starting to understand the various tools we have in our toolbox and the different ways that different kinds of capital can pull on different levers. So Giselle, you touched on this by talking about how a particular intervention might be best resourced by grant capital versus investment capital. And so the reason we are building this new model at the Equality Fund is because we really understand that and hadn't seen that it was all being developed under one ecosystem or one organization. As mentioned, we're not going it alone. We have lots of partners, and that's really at the core of our DNA and how we do things, because there's no one organization, obviously, that can solve gender inequality at a global scale. But really the integration of a disruptive philanthropy program, our philanthropy team, our fundraisers, yes, I think they would describe themselves as that, but they're also program designers. So our philanthropy program is not only about raising philanthropic capital, it's also designing programs that seeks to, and Rehana touched on this a little bit, build community, like GIIN does with impact investors, like NEED does, of course, with philanthropists and impact investors too, that enables meaningful and I would say provocative connections amongst those of us that are ready for a different kind of change at a different pace and more sustainably. So I think we as funders ourselves, along with our donor partners, many of you I know are here at this conference, are challenging traditional ways of practicing philanthropy to one that is not donor directed or top down to say, here we sit in the global north with solutions, but actually we have resources and power that we are shifting in a way that is deeply trusting. It challenges assumptions. It challenges power structures. We talk a lot about shifting power at the Equality Fund, and that requires that we examine who's giving up their power in order for it to be shifted and shared. And that can be a very uncomfortable and provocative conversation to have with ourselves and with each other. The Equality Fund is creating the space to do that. That's why we call it courageous philanthropy. I would say our program is really rooted deeply in trust again, a willingness to enable and support partners who are proximate and in community, proximate to problems, and have their own solutions that have just never been resourced sustainably in its scale.
Great, and maybe I'll shift gear as I see a question asking about, as investors or donors beginning to explore impact investing, there are inevitable questions. Inevitably, there are questions about impact versus return. I think that's an incredibly important question, so thanks for raising that. I would say the conversation about impact performance or impact achieved versus financial return should really be situated in a broader context of what are those factors that investors, any investors, and in this case, impact investors, consider when they're making a decisions. So what we know is that impact investments can yield a variety of spectrum of return, from concessionary to risk-adjusted market returns. All depends on the particular investment strategies. And we have also have studies that have shown a return of market rates, returns, and as with all investments, it depends on the selection of fund managers. So those fundamentals or fundamental considerations, that's the tenets of investing hold for impact investing. In addition, I would say, when we think about impact versus return, let's also consider what other factors investors, when they make investment choices, look at. They, in addition to those two, they look at risk. What is the risk tolerance when it comes to volatility of the investment itself? Risk as it impacts the financial, social, and environmental aspect of the investment. There's also another piece about the capacity of the team in sourcing. So it's really a multifaceted approach in thinking about holistically, what would I want an investment or a portfolio of investments to generate? I would, at the end of this, if you search for the GIIN, we actually did a report earlier this year that really speaks to this point. Not only are we highlighting the financial performance of different types of impact investments in private equity, debt, and real assets. We also have, in this particular report, highlights in greater details how, with examples of impact investors, the various factors or facets that they consider in making decisions in which how impact versus financial return way is just one dimension. So that's how I would kind of think about the question. Let me see, I'm looking at any additional ones. There may be one, and an additional one around inequality. I don't know if Rehana, you want to take that, or is it Jessica?
No, I'm happy to. I guess maybe I'll Giselle, I really loved the way that you articulated the risk return trade-off, because I think one of the things that we've noticed, not just at the Equality Fund, but broadly in the work that we do at Spectrum Impact, is that there is a misperception, I think, of that impact investing is both a silver bullet and not an investment strategy. And I think one of the hardest things we've all had to reconcile with is that impact investing is not an appropriate tool in all cases. And part of the reason it's not appropriate is because it is an investment strategy that, to Giselle's point, even if you are willing to accept concessions around returns, you are investing for leverage of some kind. And so I think one of the things that has been so fundamental to learn, not just over the course of the Equality Fund, but particularly over the 18 months that we have all been trying to survive COVID together, is that we absolutely need multi-stakeholder approaches. We cannot build an investment-only strategy. It'll never work. It'll never be compelling and convincing enough to solve, 100-year-old systemic issues in some of the places that we work. And so we've got a few questions in the chat about, what do we do? How do we build investments in a way to solve these problems? And I think what we've learned is that an investments-only approach is rarely successful. And for so many of you that have been doing programmatically this work so thoughtfully for years and years and years, I encourage you to think about impact investing as a supplement, right? As a way to build an investments approach that actually matches what you're doing in grant making, and to have those things coexist compellingly together. We had a question in here about how to really do that on in a foundation, how to actually design an allocation. And one of the things that we tell clients often is don't feel sort of any shame or restriction around your restrictions. If you are operating a foundation that needs to generate liquidity and just cannot put principal at risk, there are impact investment solutions that will apply in every single asset class. And the GIIN has done a phenomenal job of putting research out there, not just about this space writ large, which they have, but asset class by asset class examples and case studies that show you that you can have as much impact in public equities as you can in private debt. What needs to change is your expectations and your time horizon and your liquidity tolerance. And so those of you who are feeling like impact investing just needs to live in private equity and venture capital, that hasn't been our experience at the Equality Fund. That building a 100% gender lens portfolio has meant finding gender lens products in every single asset class. So really do take the time, and clearly the bravery is there because you're all here, but take the time and the bravery to just sort of take a look at where your assets currently are, and then use resources like the GIIN's resources to start to source solutions, gender or otherwise, in every single asset class, because they're certainly there. Was there any other questions? Oh, please, Giselle.
Oh no, I was just going to appreciate the last point you made, because for those on the call may have been following the impact investing journey from the start, and and it's true, probably in the earlier days, the GIIN was founded in 2009. In the early days, we're working with primarily many impact investors that are operating the private markets, but I very much appreciate the point, Rehana, you made about the diversity of asset classes, and it's not just limited to the private markets, but there are opportunities in the listed market space as well. Yeah, just wanted to underscore that point. So I think it's a lot of times the question is, how to get started as a philanthropic entity or go into impact investing. I think it's important to just recognize it is a journey. It is really a lot of different inquiries, that there are many others, foundations that have moved from traditionally just applying the grant making as a tool to program related investments, to mission related investment. And it is very much a journey. And there are peers out there. Again, if you come to the GIIN, I hope that you can find resources as well as peers that you can learn from, in addition, of course, to practitioners that we have on this call between Rehana and Jessica.
Giselle, maybe we can end on that, because there's been a couple great questions here about how to get started. When we sent out those poll questions, very many of you actually said that your biggest challenge was how to get started. And I think if I start, Giselle, I'm just going to big up the GIIN the whole time. So maybe let's start with you. And then Jess and I can weigh in on some resources that we've used, and also ways that you can get involved with the Equality Fund if you so choose. But Giselle, why don't you kick us off?
Yeah. I will maybe speak broadly to some of the steps, and also refer to, I think there's a question earlier about this. It depends on, let's just say who we have in the audience, and I can't see the attendees, but let's just say you actually represent a family office, or you're coming from a family that wants to step into this. I think, or even if you're a foundation, really the first step is defining, right? Be very clear about the North Star, right, of what you're trying to accomplish. Forget about whether it is impact investing or grants to start with, right? Being able to be very clear what you're trying to accomplish. And then it is really I think a lot of it really, our experience is, talking to peers who have gone through this journey. How do you develop, if you're on the investment side, if you're an investment officer for a foundation, think about, how would changing the investment strategy, the policy, right? What does that mean in order to institutionalize this practice? And another part of it is also, you may be needing, and if you're working with an external CIO, And I think there's a conversation to get started there, which is, what kind of offerings do you have? So I think there are really many different starting points that I think is a little bit hard to say this is one size fit all. But I do think every step of the way, it is very much around asking specific questions. And once you have a point of view as to what are the areas or impact themes that you would like to work on, I think Iris Plus is an excellent resource. Within that system, it walks you through, and it has a ton of research that we develop with topical experts in the industry to develop, different strategic goals, and it spells out a lot of things that our users of Iris Plus have found very helpful. In almost like prompting them to think of issues and topics that they haven't thought about independently. And then within Iris Plus, there are also a lot of resources, which we call use cases and guidance that walks through, many different examples of real life, asset managers as well as asset owners, how they have set up their investment strategy and the IMM. So for those online, happy to, if you can reach out offline, I'm happy to also direct you to some of the research, but I'll turn over to you, Rehana, to build on that.
Yeah, I think that's great. I guess for me, for folks that are trying to get involved, particularly on the gender lens investing side, I think the in addition to the resources that Giselle laid out, which are phenomenal, I guess I would just say that a reminder to all of us that GLI and all lenses like it are a lens, and that they can exist in the investment process in two really compelling places. The first could be actually in your investment thesis. So the things that you invest in could be one of those outcomes that we talked about a little bit earlier around addressing gender. And that could really be an indicator of where your capital goes. But there's also gender lens investment in the investment process. Sometimes I think we get really excited about the end beneficiary of capital that we forget that we're also trying to change the system. So one of the things that's been really critical at the Equality Fund is to do both. We want to put capital in the hands of women and girls that are working for women and girls, but we also want to kind of turn the table on the capital markets. And so that means how we do due diligence, where we source pipeline, who we employ and hire, that all has to be reflective of our feminist values. And so if you are in an organization that feels like directing capital might be the harder way to go, don't forget that in the operating structure of investments, you can actually be a feminist investor through using GLI tools in the investment process. And so hopefully, over the next 6 to 8 months, as the Equality Fund builds our gender lens investment criteria, we too will be able to contribute back to the field and provide you all with more and more resources. But just being here today and getting started is huge. Maybe Jess, you can have the last word before we give people a bit of a break before they attend the rest of the conference.
I couldn't have said it better myself. It's just an invitation to be on the journey with us. We at the Equality Fund, it's part of our feminist values to be very transparent in what we are learning. As Rehana said, we have been very consultative all along. I was interested to see through the poll that many of you, the barriers are my co-decision makers aren't there yet, or I don't know where to begin. And we have been there. So lots of different ways to engage. I would direct you also to the GIIN and join us at the Equality Fund. Join one of our philanthropy programs. Come on the learning journey as we design our theory of change in the investment program and explore ways that we're deploying capital while trying to change the system in which we're operating, right? It's a big job. We can't do it alone. Follow us and engage with us on social. There are so many ways that we can be learning from all of you as well. So come on in.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you. Thank you all for joining.